Hey, this is Todd. I wanted to talk about episode 3 of season 8, the final season of Game of Thrones, the long night, the giant battle at Winterfell, and talk about how you can use that as inspiration for running large scale narrative battles in your campaign. I'm not going to get into super details about the actual ins and outs of the battles or what happened to who or who happened to what, but obviously there's going to be some spoilers. So if you haven't watched the episode yet, go ahead and give it a watch and then come back and cue this back up. This episode was all about the final confrontation between the Night King and the White Walkers and the Army of the Dead and Jon Snow and Daenerys and the dragons and the free living peoples who had basically all gathered at Winterfell for this final assault. So if you watch the show, it's 90% of it is this giant battle taking place around and across and inside of Winterfell. It's something that I see come up a lot of times. DMs asking they want to run a big battle, how to run it, or what mechanically how to do it, or how to do it in the flow of the game. There are usually a couple of different answers to that. One is to run it sort of like a war game, and I think Matt Colville and some of the ways he runs his battles is like this. So you can give the players commands of different elements of the army, and they can fight individually. They can order their units and kind of run it in sort of a war game fashion. So you have basically the war game skirmish type idea of pitting these units against each other, controlled by the players, at the same time as the player characters are launching their own powers and abilities, potentially within their units or in a separate sort of s- simultaneous running battle that's occurring while their greater forces are at work. The other way to run a battle that uh, comes up is to run it in a narrative way, which is we're not so much concerned about the war gaminess of it. We'll figure out the ins and outs of casualties and whatnot. Maybe we'll roll some dice afterwards or whatnot. But the idea of simulating the battle as a war game is really not what we're after. We're looking to run it as more of a story, which fits up more with how the show is doing it. The show is not trying to show you what's happening in every sector of Winterfell and what's happening here and what's happening on the east and the west. And it's not really, it's concentrating on these character moments. Where are the characters and what are they doing? And how does what they're doing impact the battle at large? And that's a very, I guess, in a sense, a much easier way to run these sorts of battles than doing it the war gamey way, though it probably depends on what you're comfortable with. Obviously, if you come from a war game background or you're comfortable with war games, then doing it the war game way is not really complicated. It's just a different way of doing it. Whereas the other way is more that the larger battle is sort of a backdrop, and really you're concentrating on these character moments within that backdrop, or in front of it in the foreground. If you watch the after the episode talk, the producers spoke about wanting to break up the battle into these smaller components that you could zoom in and look at, whether that's Daenerys and John on the dragons together or individually, or it's Sir Jamie and Brienne of Tarth in one spot, or in the crypt, Tyrion and that stuff going on. So you have these smaller moments that the battle's raging on outside, and then you kind of zoom into these spots. And really, it's really the same thing as what you want to do if you were going to try this type of battle at your table. Is you would take the party, or you could split up the party, and then you're going to zoom in on them, and then what happens in their little areas will then contribute to what's happening in the total. So what I mean by that is, let's say you have your party and they've decided to defend their cattle. Say they were put in charge of Winterfell or a similar fort or keep, and they're going to defend it. And they may say, "Well, I'm going to send the ranger and the rogue are going to go to the west wall, and the wizard's going to be up in the tower, and he's going to be raining down long distance AOE type stuff. And we're going to send these guys to the east wall, and these guys are going to man the gate." At that point, you could then run these different combats either at the same time or separately, depending on how you want to, run your table time. But then you would go and say, okay, this is what's happening on the west wall. And if they can hold the west wall, then that will help the overall effort in this way. Obviously, if they lose the west wall, that will impact these other things. Maybe it will impact the wizard. If they get through that west wall, they can maybe get to the tower. They can get behind the people who are in the courtyard manning the gate. If they hold the gate, then that will create an element that they can use. So each one of these situations has a significance. And we're going to look at that and say, okay, depending on how the party does in these different areas, that is going to indicate how the battle is progressing. If they hold all these areas and they're victorious and successful, then that will show that they are winning the overall battle. If they're losing, then that will make things more desperate. That will show that they're losing the battle, and then we can play from there, generate what happens next, whether it's a Helm's Deep type situation where they have to fall back to an inner keep and try to figure out what to do from there, whether they need to just flat out retreat or come up with some other plan. So you're taking this big battle and you're breaking up into chunks, but you're not worried about the chunks that your party's not at. You're only worried about the ones where they are. And everything else you're going to sort of simulate on some level. Again, you can use dice, whatever, but really the main thing you're looking at is how successful are the party in these smaller battles, these smaller actions. How they do will then tell you how the main battle is doing. When you're getting these kind of situations, I think a lot of times, and this doesn't happen just in these kind of battle situations, but often I see GMs asking questions how to help their party do one thing or help their party do another thing. I need to run this. How do I do that? I think it's important not to pre-plan for the party how they're going to say defend a castle or do something. If they know the siege is coming and it's something that is part of the plot moving forward. It's part of this the scenario. They understand that as events are happening, the army's coming. They've either ridden up to this castle or fallen back to this castle or decide to make their stand here. I think it's important for their ownership that you let them plan it out. Maybe you do that the session before you're going to run the battle. I think certainly you want to give them some time to game plan what they're going to do, and you're going to need that time because what I would recommend is let them come up with their game plan. You could do it pre-game as part of sort of in between sessions at the end of one session, the beginning of one session, but you might need some time as you want to take their game plan to then figure out how you're going to divide these actions. So you don't necessarily need to have a Western Wall action if they're not posting anybody there for whatever reason. And you can decide whether that means, well, they didn't post anybody there. So in 5 turns or however long in 1 hour, the enemy's going to make it over, or there's enough troops there that it's basically going to stay as a static situation until other things change, right? So you're going to look at their game plan and then where they position themselves and use that to create these smaller action moments. So if they decide to put everybody at that front gate because they think it's super important, then that's where you're going to put your action spot. And you can use what's happening elsewhere to figure out what you're going to do and even add some interesting tension if they are, because for whatever reason they want to keep that main gate clear. You can let them know that in the absence of them being on the walls, and again, this is information that fictionally they would easily get, people yelling down and saying, hey, they're coming over. We can hold it for an hour, we can hold it for 10 minutes, and then they're coming, and then the party can decide at that point, well, we need to man the walls, or for whatever our plan is, that's enough. That's enough time. That's all the time we need. So we're gonna do it. But I think it's important to let the party create their own game plan, and that way, I think they'll really, at least in my experience, you take more ownership of it when it's your ideas and your plan and you're trying to make it happen, as opposed to the DM positioning you around where they think you want to be or what they think makes for a cool moment or story. So, given all that, I would say if you're going to run a battle and you're looking at this episode, and I don't want to get into again, I wasn't going to get into much spoiler territory. I don't want to talk about, I'm not going to talk about the tactics or whatever. I wouldn't use, I would say, please, gosh, do not use the logic or strategy or tactics that they displayed on the show because they were terrible. I can't even understand most of the decisions that either side made. It's very much cinematic. And I think they did a good enough job just because I didn't really start thinking about how poor some of the decisions were mostly until towards really the end of the episode, which to me at least is like, okay, they kept me engaged enough in the tension and the flow that I wasn't just pulled out saying like, why are they doing that? But there are definitely some things that stick out to me as like, I don't know why they're doing this. It makes no sense. But I think that certainly when you look at it as kind of I mean, I don't know, certainly on the scale of TV, we haven't seen any kind of fantasy battles of this scope. Maybe not since really, I mean, Lord of the Rings, had Helm's Deep and the Pelennor Fields and that stuff. But beyond that, there really haven't been great examples. I really like the way that the dragons are realized in here in the show. They're not the sort of hyper intelligent dragons of D&D, but I like that they showed sort of the power that those kind of units have because very often in media and in D&D too, you end up encountering dragons in their lairs, and they're kinda just stuck, and they're not particularly mobile, and they just sort of become hit sponges, and then they kinda go down. Maybe they hover a bit. But here, showing the mobility of the dragons, showing them really as the kinda formidable war machines that they could be as they're swooping and gliding and just burning huge swaths through the battlefield. I thought that was really nice, and it's a great imagery to use. I think also one thing that they did that I appreciate, and they're going to do this, and this is not something you can mandate. What you only thing you can do with what I'm about to say is you could try to create space to do that, and that is for characters to do sort of their signature things. So each of the characters kind of got a moment, not necessarily to do like a signature ability, like Arya got to be badass, but she didn't do sort of, faceless man face switching. And they also sort of played up, and they talked about this on the after show too, that it was a callback to when she was vulnerable because she started off in that battle being super cocky of being, death has many faces and I'm ready to see this one. And, they brought her to another point of reality where she's just running and that fear is there that she hasn't felt in a while since she's been sort of badass warrior priestess. And Jamie and everybody got to kind of have their sort of big moments. Some of them, it's got some kind of death moments. But everyone sort of had a space. And again, in because it's a story that's written and filmed and everything else, is yes, they can make sure that each character gets sort of a beat, a moment to kind of have a bit of a signature sort of thing to this battle. And you, as the GM, you can't do that. You can't force somebody to here's your signature moment, go. But what you can do is you can create spaces for them to do that, and that might mean that if you have the rogue in a certain area, that yeah, there's things that they can do roguish stuff, or you're more open to whether it's through rule of cool or just being sure in the chaos of battle you can get some backstabs going, or you can try to sneak or do something right. Just give them that everyone that moment to feel kind of that they're I guess that they're fulfilling their character potential in some way. And it can be big, it can be small, particularly if you're bouncing around with different people in this big battle and maybe you're spending 10 minutes on the rogue and you have 10 minutes on the fighter and the ranger and then 10 minutes on the wizard, and then by the time you get over to say the warlock over here, they've been kind of watching for 40 minutes. It's nice that in that 10 minutes that they're going to get that they can have some fun and do something cool. It doesn't have to be game breaking. Doesn't have to be something where they get to do just something ultra crazy, but kind of let them have their moment, even if it's just in describing them raining down Eldritch blasts or whatever on to enemies or doing something cool. Just give them that moment because in these kind of battles and really in a lot of combat, there's a fair amount of waiting around, particularly if you're spotlighting different groups, subgroups of your party. There's a lot of weighing things down. So takeaways from this is definitely, encourage your party to come up with a game plan. In this episode, they showed them sort of laying out how they're going to do it. They wanted to trap the Night King and sort of have him come into this area so they could kind of gang up on him. And obviously, the plan fell apart right away, which usually happens with plans. But they had that plan. By the same token, let your party come up with a plan, and then you figure out how to turn that plan into those action moments to play out, and then play to see what happens. Don't pre-script how it's going to go. Use the dice or your friends if you're not sure what an enemy would do. If you're looking at it from the Night King's perspective and it seems obviously it's a trap in that grove and yet that's where his target is, stat out some attributes or just roll 1 and 6, 2 and 6, whatever dice you want to roll, and see how they act, and then play it accordingly. I already talked about allowing players to showcase their signature abilities or sort of their potential, kind of fulfill their potential during these moments. Obviously, the big thing, play to see what happens. Another thing is it's good to include some kind of downtime or at least an ebb and flow to the rhythm of the battle. On the show, they do this by going to the crypts or going to other. It's pretty much the crypts where they could, or when the battle would die down for moments, they could kind of have these sighs where you could sort of, as an audience, you could take a breath. The characters could all take a breath, that get their healing surges going for the next craziness, but you want to build those in so you're not just in initiative necessarily all the time, just bang, bang, bang. Particularly when you're running a dynamic battle and the battle is changing depending on how the party's doing, and maybe they're having mixed success, so they're winning over here, but they're losing over here. You want to give them a chance to update their battle plan, change up what they're doing, and they need that kind of rest period to get some intelligence, how they're doing, change it up. And they did this a little bit in the episode they showed. Obviously, one of the big things was the Dothraki got wiped out at the very beginning. So instead of holding the dragons back to protect Bran or to be there to trap the Night King, Dany just can't watch, and so she takes off, and then of course Jon follows, and so that part of the game plan changes. Obviously, Arya does her own game plan at the end to help save everybody's bacon. So be flexible, be adaptive, give some pauses for breathers, but also so everybody can sort of update the world state and then see where everybody shakes out, move forward. What I would say to avoid if you're going to run a battle like this, primarily don't script the outcome. Don't script where the Night King's going to show up or what he's going to do, or say, okay, this is how I'm going to run it. Obviously, in a purely narrative show, it's all scripted. So it makes perfect sense that at the last second, Theon's there and he's the last one standing, and then Arya comes in and she's able to do her little trick and work. And I think they're probably, you could. I'm sure there's some other if people would suggest, oh, you can do this, you could fudge your dice or do whatever. And of course, you can. You can, run the game however you run the game. But I feel like you can sort of trap yourself in that thinking, because once you start on that, focusing your path on this has got to happen, then it doesn't really allow for other things to maybe get the due that they should. And it can sort of stifle a clever play in ways that you may not appreciate, because you think, no, no, this is the cool moment where I want to get everybody to. But there are all these other cool moments that are happening, and they're not getting the attention, or they're not getting the amount of weight that they deserve, because you're focused on this one outcome. So if somebody had a really cool plan to intercept the Night King before he even gets to Bran or in the field or somewhere else, maybe that would have been a really cool moment. But you don't let that happen because you want him to end up in that grove to fight Theon, or in this case, maybe there's one player character who's there waiting, and you want to give that player character this one-on-one battle, but that means you deny this other character this moment, which might have been just as cool or even cooler than that one, right? You'll never know. Don't script the outcomes. Play to see what happens. Let the dice fall where they may. You have your game plan. Let the players come up with their game plan and see what happens. Have fun with just seeing where all that chaos and everything and the clever play and all that, just how everything falls out. Like I mentioned before, please don't model anyone's tactics on what they did at Winterfell. They make so many poor decisions. I don't understand why you put your trebuchet in front of the castle. I don't understand why you send the Dothraki out into the dark just to die. Essentially, I'm not even sure. I get on the one hand why you may want to make your stand at Winterfell, because the longer winter and things come on, and the more that the Night King is able to just ravage through the countryside, his army's only going to grow because his army's death, and he can seemingly at will just power up people. At the same token, when you send out a wave of cavalry like that, one, I don't know what they can do. I don't know what, I guess, maybe ultimately, I don't know what the advantage of cavalry is against a mindless undead army, because they can't really do the things that cavalry were known for doing, which is basically breaking up and dispersing, infantry, because the dead don't care. And every Dothraki that falls is just 1 minute away from just being raised back up and made part of the enemy. So I don't know why you just express deliver on horseback a whole bunch more, essentially, troops to the Night King, particularly in the dark. I get that the Red Woman lit their kopeshes or whatever I don't know what they have, I don't know if it's a slightly different weapon, but whatever, they lit their swords on fire and sends them out in the night, and then it was a neat image. And I think there was a lot of this stuff in that episode that doesn't make a lot of sense if you look at it outside of the imagery it creates, because it was a cool image to see all those lights and then they just start flickering out in the dark. It was a neat image. I thought that was really neat, but the actual tactic doesn't make sense at all. If you're going to make your stand at Winterfell because you want to make sure that the Night King just doesn't have a super big army, I don't know why you put everybody in front of it. Why not hold to the keep, hold the rear open so that you can potentially escape, instead of letting yourself be suckered. I don't know even know what the word is, suckered into sort of this charge against an enemy that overwhelms you already in numbers. It's not a smart play. And when the army that you're fighting, this enemy, is undead, they don't have the kind of factors that really are what make. Because I was thinking, well, wouldn't you want to bring the cavalry on the in the flanks, right? So let the undead army come. Probably just send the dragons up and let them blow fire on them first anyway, and then have the Dothraki maybe hit them from the sides. But again, if they're mindless, they don't have any fear. They're not going to break up. There's all these things that we use cavalry to punch into the infantry and try to get them to scatter and withdraw. None of that can happen because it's basically just mindless. So I don't know what the advantage was. I certainly don't know what the advantages of applying the cavalry the way that they did. And there's a lot of these decisions on both sides. And for the Night King, if Bran was really his sole target, you think he could have made stronger plays to get Bran way before Bran ended up sitting in Winterfell. I mean, Bran was on the other side of the wall for a long, long time. And yeah, I know he was at the tree, and I guess that was protected for a while, and Hodor and all that. But still, it seemed like there was much better opportunities for the Night King to get Bran. And of course, if he's playing this long game and he doesn't care, and winter's coming and all this stuff, then you could just surround and starve out that Winterfell, no problem. Just get him that way. There was really no reason I could see if time wasn't a factor for the Night King, why he would take this battle the way they wanted to give it to him. He could just go and ravage everywhere else and just keep increasing his armies and just wait and let them rot in Winterfell, or force them to then come out of Winterfell and take the field against him, which they kind of obliged with him anyway, and it doesn't make any sense. But anyway, so please don't use please don't use their tactics. Cool episode visually, not so much if you're looking at it as wanting to do war tactics, so please don't use them. But let me know what you thought of the episode. If you've run battles, I personally I like running both narrative battles and more wargaming battles, or combining the two. I think that's one thing as sort of a last thing is you can definitely combine both. So if you want to take the units that are fighting and you could use skirmish rules if you're interested in applying the movement and flanking and all of those things to the units, or if you could use something. They had these other rules. I think first edition or second edition had them. I want to say they were called War Machine, but it basically was a way of just simulating an encounter. And it wasn't so much. It wasn't. They would, depending on the version you looked at. Some of them they had things where you could add modifiers to whether this enemy was being flanked or was charging or whatever. Basically, you could just take two units of different types, include fantasy types, obviously, or mundane types, bang them into each other, and then you know you roll some dice, look at some tables, and you could see who won, who lost, and kind of what the casualties are. And you can use that as well if you really want to look at and say, I have 50 men on this wall, and you can kind of stat up an idea of what they look like, and there are this many people coming up the wall or over the wall or whatever. Then, and you could absolutely do that too. They're good to feed off each other. I really like the idea that the party are taking pivotal roles in the combat. It makes them feel heroic, because in a real just war game type battle, it may make no difference what they're doing. And in fact, if you look at the episode, probably Jamie and Brienne in reality did nothing one way or another. Yes, they piled up a lot of bodies, but it probably had essentially zero effect on everything that happened. Probably most of them didn't have any effect. I mean, all the Dothraki went out there, did nothing. So when you look at it that way, it's kind of like, well, they were fighting, but Samwell didn't do anything. I mean, he's there. Again, you're just collecting corpses, but has no real impact. But I like the idea in some sense of giving the characters sort of a larger than life role in the battle. But you can certainly supplement what's happening elsewhere and really make it feel dynamic. And there can really be some tension there, because you could have, in a case, I'm trying to think of what kind of a real life battle it would be like, but a sense where the party is succeeding, but they're losing. So they're doing everything right, but it's not enough. And that can really be an interesting tension. You don't want to use it all the time, and it can also be undercutting to the party when you feel like, hey, we're doing everything we can do, but we're losing. But not all battles work that way, and it can be, what goals are you accomplishing? Yeah, maybe you are losing the battle, but you are getting more survivors out of the castle, or you're getting more of the troops out, or you're delaying this force enough to enable other things down the line. So you can have some interesting stuff with that. And part of keeping it dynamic for both you as the player and you as the GM is to use the dice, use skirmish or war game rules or mass combat rules or whatever you want to do to keep everything dynamic and not not prescripted. And I think that makes it the most fun for me as a GM, anyways, when I don't know what's going to happen, and I'm just as interested in how the dice are going to turn out as the players. Hope you enjoy this one. Like I said, let me know if you've run these kind of battles or how you run them. If you use any particular tools or rules or things that you like. If you took any lessons away, good or bad or ugly, from the fight at Winterfell, please let me know in the comments, and I will talk to you later.